Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vardhan. Today's session is going to be completely about Selenium Webdriver. So, I'm going to teach you something that's really exciting, right? And that is the very famous data-driven testing in Selenium framework. So, let me first get started with my session by showing you my customary agenda slide. And well, for the sake of any newcomers in today's session, I will quickly go through the role of Selenium as an automation testing tool in today's market. And after that, I will explain what is data-driven testing framework. Then I will talk about how to perform data-driven testing using Selenium WebDriver. And I will conclude today's session by giving you a demonstration of the same. Okay, guys? So let me just quickly go to the next slide. And let's start. Okay, so first of all, Selenium is an open source tool which is used for automating web browser tests, right? And it's mainly used for functional testing. And three popular or the most important reasons why Selenium is really popular in the market is because of these three, right? The test scripts can be written in any of the languages, like it can be written on any programming language like Java, Python, Perl, Ruby, and C#. And another reason it's very popular is because it supports cross-browser testing. You people should know that cross-browser testing means you can execute the tests in different browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Safari browser, or even Internet Explorer. And finally, the most important reason why it's again really popular is because it can be supported on these three important operating systems like Windows, Linux, or Mac. So these are some of the main reasons why Selenium is really popular as an automation testing tool. Okay, now this should be enough. It should be a good enough introduction to you people. And getting to the main topic of today, what exactly is data-driven testing framework, right? And what are its benefits? Well, data-driven testing, or DDT as it is famously acronymed, is an effective means to test any data set which might change over time. Okay, so this is the best technique to test any application for whose the data set change is the only constant. Okay, so to be more precise, what it means is the data-driven framework here, it's a testing strategy in which the data set under test is stored separately from the test script. So as you can see from the image on your screen over here, the Selenium test code will be independent of the data set, or rather let me put it this way. The Selenium test code is independent of whatever is being tested. So what this means is that if my test case is about checking the login access to any website, then I can store the credentials separately and have the Selenium code stored separately. The Selenium code will perform all the operations needed as it usually will do in a normal framework, like instantiating a browser driver, navigating to the specified web page, but except passing the login and the password credentials. So even the post-test action like quitting the browser will be performed by the Selenium code itself. But the very fact of passing the username and password fields will be fetched from an external file like an Excel, right? So most of you know this part. So there are loads of benefits with this framework, and firstly being that the automation testing will be driven by the data set under test in this case. Okay, and another benefit is that the same test script can be used to test multiple data sets. Now at this time you can ask me, why is it that the data-driven framework is probably the only option or is the best option in this case? Well, I can present you this scenario. Okay, now let's say suppose we need to test the login form with multiple input fields for 100 different users. Okay, to test this you have probably three different approaches. Okay, so one would be to create 100 scripts, each script for one user, and execute those tests one after the other. We could do that. Or we could do this. We could create one test case with one particular user's access and then run that test script, and then the next time we want to perform the test, we can replace that credentials with another user's. We can do this, okay? But again, even this would have to be executed 100 times. Or finally, we have the third option, that is the data-driven strategy, in which you have your test code, and whenever the code is getting executed, it would fetch the data or import the data from the Excel and then execute that. Correct? So that's simpler, right? So you're just executing it once, and the rest would be taken care of by Selenium. So with the help of Apache POI, it would fetch the data from the Excel. So that's the big advantage here, right? So that's the thing. So first two scenarios are very tedious and time consuming. Hence the data-driven approach is the best suited. Let me go to the next slide, and here is where the important question is. Does Selenium WebDriver support reading of data from an Excel file for input? Okay, by default Selenium does not. Okay, we have to use this open source framework called Apache POI for that purpose, right? So what is Apache POI in this case? Apache POI is an open source framework written in Java to support the read and write operations of Microsoft Office files on Selenium. So it's basically a library which can be referred to in the Selenium code. Okay, so I can download all those jars and library files, similar to how you download the Selenium libraries and jars. You can place them in the same project directory. You can put them in the feed them in the path in Eclipse, and you can get started. So you have certain inbuilt libraries and functions which you can use to get data in, to load your Excel file, to set your data, your Excel file, to set the rows and columns. You can do all these things. You can basically just, instead of hard coding the data set, you can use this framework for getting data in from the POI, from the Excel to your Selenium Webdriver, right? And there are loads of benefits with Apache POI. Like, see, one advantage is that easy maintenance of the code can be done, right? And even the data, even the test coverage of the data set will improve. So that's these are the two advantages which are really popular among the other things, right? Two big advantages among other things. So that's what I wanted to speak about Apache POI. Now, moving on to the next slide. This is the representation of the demo that I'm going to show you. Okay, so I have an Excel file that looks something like this. I have the username field in one column, and I have the password field in another column, and I have the so these are pairs of credentials. Okay, so these two together make up one pair of credentials. This is the username, this is the password for one row, and similarly I have 5 different rows here. And what I would be doing is I would be feeding these as input to my Selenium code. Okay, and I would be using Apache POI. Okay, so I have another class called Excel data file. Okay, and in that file I have instantiated or created. In that particular Excel file, I have placed all the libraries and jars that Apache POI requires. And when Apache POI, gets all the data in, that can be used and called in the main function. So I can, so here is where I'm using the data provider, and I'm calling that Excel file. I'm providing the path where it's present, and I'm doing that. So this might be a little confusing right now, but let me go further. And when I get started with the demonstration, I could explain it in a better fashion, right? So let's go to the hands-on now and see how this can be achieved. So guys, this is my main program which needs to be executed, right? And let me explain on a high level what I have over here. Okay, now the skeleton basically consists of this main project. So this is my class DDTXL, and I have the main method over here called demo project, and what it does is it does the regular job of creating, first of all, instantiating a Chrome driver, then navigating to a particular site or a web page where I want to perform my test, and then finding elements there. And in my case, I'll be finding 3 elements. One for finding the username field, the second is to find the password field, and then the third one is the login button. So I would obtain find these 3 fields, and in my first case I would be sending my username. Okay, second case I would be sending the password, and the login button, however, I would be clicking that login button. Now, usually what we would do is we would, in double quotes here, we would specify what the username is and what the password is. Okay, but the variation this time is I've given username and password as variables here. Okay, now these are present as arguments in this method. Okay, now you can ask me the questions can come up in your mind as to from where will these details come, where will the username and where will the password credentials come from, right, in my code. So to answer that, I have another method over here. Now before I explain this method, you need to note that I've annotated this main method of mine with @test_data_provider. Now when we say data provider, it basically means that the method that is defined over here, this is expecting some kind of input from another method named test data. Okay, and in my case I have the name of the method here as @data_provider, and the name of course is test data. Okay, the same thing that I've specified over here, and I've annotated it with @test_provider to identify this as one of the data providers. Now, ideally in a working environment, there can be multiple data providers, right? So there can be multiple methods from where data can come. So at that time, it would be, the data provider would be the constant thing, and the name would change. So here in this case, it's test data 1, test data. If I want to have another data provider, it would be test data 1 and test data 2 similarly. Okay, and that is what has to be specified here from where the data is coming in. Okay, now that's what's going to happen. And now that you know what happens over here, let me go and explain this part from where the data is actually going to my main method. Okay, now this is the method which is doing the execution, and that method gets data from here. And there are three important lines that you need to know. Okay, these are the three important lines, where the first one is I'm creating a new object for my class. So I've created another class called read Excel file, and you can see that Excel file right here. Okay, now what this file is doing is, well, okay, before that, what I'm doing is I'm creating the object along with the path of the Excel file. Okay, now let me go here and tell you what this file does. Now what this file does is, when given or when invoked along with the Excel path, it would load a new, basically load a new file. Okay, so these are basically Apache POI libraries which I've used. Okay, you use them to basically set up your environment where you're creating a new Excel file, and then you're setting up a file input stream so that the data can come in from the Excel file to your Selenium. And then you finally, I'm using a variable called WB to load a new project, to load that particular Excel file. Okay, so that's what is happening here. And this, if you notice, I've given it inside a try block. Well, the simple reason why I have it inside a try block is so that, well, in case some kind of an exception occurs or some kind of a problem or error comes in, that can be thrown in as an exception. Okay, so that is the only reason. I don't want my execution to be hampered and be stopped. So that's why if any exception happens in getting the file, it would basically be thrown as a println statement, and it would be printed here, right? So this is the first thing that happens, where my Excel path is given, and based on the path that is fed to me, I'm loading a new file for that, and I'm creating a file input stream for that, and I'm setting up a workbook for that. Okay, so I've created a variable workbook over here, as you can see, XSSF workbook and XSSF sheet. Now these two are again Apache POI libraries, and WB, I'm specifying that it's a workbook which I want to create, right? The same thing that I'm specifying. And with XSFS sheet, with this keyword, I'm saying that sheet is the sheet in my workbook which I'm working on. Now your Excel file can have multiple sheets, right? So that's why I've created this. Now this is the Excel file which I have fed as input, and this is where my test data is present. Now this currently has only one sheet, so that's why I have not specified anything more. I have not specified sheet 1 or sheet 2, so that's the reason. Now getting back to my main problem, since when this is called, this is what is going to happen. And going to the next line, what I have here is int rows is equal to config.getRowCount. Okay, now this is basically creating a new variable called rows, and it's storing integer data there. Okay, and what is it getting stored? It's storing a value based on this function call. So it's making a function called to get row count. Okay, now this is again a new function or a new method that I have inside this particular class of mine. Okay, as you can see, there's a get row count over here, and the parameters, the arguments to this row count is sheet index. Now I've also specified the parameters here. I'm sending 0 to this particular column. Now what this means is, I'm saying once you've got my file on which I want to work, it is the sheet number in which I want to work is 0. Okay, if you see in this example also, all my data is present inside my sheet 1. Okay, but however internally this will be mapped to index number of 0. Okay, so even though it's sheet 1, the way Java works is it would internally convert it to 0, right? That's the index number. Supposing there is a sheet 2 and there is sheet 3 and sheet 4 and sheet 5, then this would be this would have an index number of 1, this would have an index number of 3, and it goes on. But however, the first one would be index number 0. So that's what I'm specifying as arguments. And when the argument is given over here, this would count the number of rows in that particular sheet. Okay, in my case, I am creating another row here, and I'm saying inside the workbook which I created, okay, which I have specified here, get the sheet number. Okay, get sheet at sheet index basically gets this particular sheet. In my case, it would be sheet number 0, and then it would say get the last row number, because I want to find the number of rows in my Excel file. Okay, get last row number would return the value of 4. So even though there are 5 rows here, the value that would be returned is 4. Again, for the same reason that Java would interpret this as 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, right? So that's how Java indexing works. So that would be present here, and whatever value is sent. So in my case, since it's 4, then there would be a mismatch, right, as to my logic and program logic. So for convenience sake, I'm appending 1 plus 1 to row. So I'm just doing a row is equal to row plus 1, and finally I'm returning row, whatever is stored here. And this is what goes back to my method, the function call over here. So that value would basically be stored inside this rows, which is present in this particular class. Okay, so one thing which you should not get confused is there's a rows over here variable, and there's another rows over here. Now they won't interfere with each other because they are defined in different classes. Okay, so this would again have the value of 5 over here. Okay, 4 plus 1 is equal to 5. Now the third important line that I have here is that of creating a new object called credentials. Okay, and I'm creating a two-dimensional array object here. And why am I creating a two-dimensional object? The reason is, every time I want to go to my Excel file and pick up the credentials, I want to pick up a pair of these credentials. So I don't want to pick up them separately, right? So I want to pick up the username first, and then I want to pick up the password along with that, and then feed them as input to my Excel file over here, username, password. So for that, I'm creating an array storage here, and I'm basically getting the data by making a function called to get data. So get data is another class that I have again in this particular file. Okay, and these two function calls are made inside a for loop, so that every time the value of 5 increases, the next row would be executed in the Excel. So first time when I'm performing the test, it would it would start with I is equal to 0. So it would start with row is equal to 0. In this case, it would be this row, and it would pick up Edureka and Edureka 1 to 3 as the credentials. Okay, and it would start executing here. So what it does here is, I'm saying my array object first for credential it would be 0. For credentials 0, 0, the data that you have to get from is, you would make a function called to get data. Okay, and you pass arguments as 0, I and 0. So in my case, if I go back here, you can see that there's another get data method here, and this method basically takes these same 3 arguments, and it takes the sheet number, row and column. And this is ideally the most important method of this whole program, because this is what does the actual fetching of data from the Excel file, right? Now if you see here, I'm basically running the for loop to obtain the value from the Excel and store it inside my array, and that's what this piece of code does over here. Okay, when you specify what is the sheet number that you want the data from and which row and cell you want your data from, then it would be executed straight away. And the code that I've written is such that I'm specifying the sheet is equal to wb.getSheet at sheet number. Okay, it will use this sheet number, and it's creating a new object string of a string type, that's data is equal to with these parameters. Okay, so it's going to get the for this particular sheet. Okay, for this sheet it's going to obtain the row and the cell. So whatever is there inside the row mentioned here and inside the cell inside this particular sheet, right, a combination of these 3, that value is what it's going to do. And the inbuilt library is get string cell value. Okay, so this is inbuilt function that you can use to get the data. So whatever is there inside the cell would be obtained. In my case, when the for loop is running for the first time, it would obtain Edureka and it would pass it. Okay, and the when this execution is done, when the I value is increased, or rather before increasing, the second when this line is being executed, it would execute for row number 0 and column number 1. So in this case, row number 0 would be Edureka itself, this row, and column would be Edureka 1 to 3. So that would be passed, and these two would be sent as my username and password. Okay, and the next time when my for loop is increasing, the I value would be increasing, and the next row would be sent, and one after the other this test would happen in this format. Okay, now I hope I did a good job in explaining the code here, because I'm going to continue with the execution. Okay, I'm going to next click on the run button to show you how the code would execute and how the data driven test would actually be performed. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go and run this program, and when you hit run, see what happens. The first set of commands would work. My Chrome browser is instantiated, and I go to the site. My username, password fields were fed with data. I've logged in successfully, and I've closed my browser because I have a driver.quit right after my code. Okay. Similarly, this time Mercury has been sent. The sign in button has been clicked on, and I've successfully logged in. Okay. This is what happened the first 2 times. Now, however, the third time when the credentials are passed, my login would fail. Now you can see that you have a different UI, right? That's what happened. So the way I've written my Excel file is such that the first 2 credentials are correct. They are valid. So it would log in, but the other 3 would fail to log in. So that's what's happening here. So you can see that for each of the 5 rows that I mentioned, it would feed the username and the password fields here, and it would show if it's logging in or not. Okay, so my test is successfully done. Now let me just open up my console here, and as you can see here, it says the total number of tests run were 5. That's because there were 5 rows in my Excel, and the failures were 3, and that's also because there were 3 invalid credentials. Okay, none were skipped, but this also means that 2 passed. Now let me show you that over here. So the first time my credentials passed, it says login successful, and again the second time when it passed, it says login successful, but after that it says failed. Okay, so it says passed demo project with these credentials, Edureka 123, and with credentials as Mercury and Mercury. Again, my project passed, this method passed, but however it failed with these credentials, and I have a set of reasons why it failed. And again, for the next failed attempt, we have this, and we have a set of reasons. Okay, but anyways, moving on to the reports here, we have the detailed report of this test, and as you can see, my default suite, my default test have all failed. Okay, now that's because well, even my DDT Excel, so this is the name of my class, right? So even this has failed. Now that's because even if one method or one test case fails inside your inside your test or inside your class, then that's considered as a failure. But however, the first 2 times when I executed with when I executed demo project with these credentials, Edureka and Edureka 1 to 3, and when I executed the same with Mercury and Mercury, it passed. Right, so that's why you can see a green tick mark here, but the other times it shows a red mark. So that is the kind of a detailed, this is not completely detailed also, but this is the kind of report that you get with the help of TestNG. And yeah, this is the code, and this is the console, this is the view that you have, and that pretty much brings an end to my session here. Okay, now this is the kind of demonstration that I want to show you. So yeah guys, so that is pretty much the end of my session here. I thoroughly enjoyed this live session, and I hope even you people learned something new today. So thanks once again, and happy learning.